culture we operate in now is not one that's biased towards faith, not biased towards following Jesus. It's biased away from. And so whether it's my neighbors, my community, our larger American context, we're missionaries. In some ways, more missionaries than places we used to send missionaries to 50 years ago.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bryant. In every episode, we bring in guests who will inspire, encourage you to be more effective in your mission field. Well, on today's episode of the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, I have with me Craig Whitney. How are you doing, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks for the invitation. It's fun to hang out and get to catch up a little bit. We haven't seen each other in a long time.
It's been a while. Yes, we teamed together when you were working with Gateway Leaders. I've been here at Gateway now 14 years. But you've been advocating for and actually planting churches for 30 years.
Yes. I hate to admit that sometimes. It's been more than 30 years since we planted a church, and that obviously just ages you. I jokingly tell people I was 12.
That's right.
I didn't minimize that, but
that's right.
Yeah, no. Been around this for a while.
Well, talk about your church planting journey, just for those who haven't had a chance to find you on the internet or know you yet. Sure. Yeah, talk about that for a moment.
Certainly, if you back up sort of 30 years ago, I was in many ways kind of the prototypical American church planter. Went off to Bible college, felt called into ministry at a high school camp, did student ministry for a little while. The guy that had been the lead pastor of the church where my dad had also been on staff became the director of church planting in our association. And so he knew me, came to me and said, "Hey, why don't you plant a church?" And so I was 26, but we said yes. And my wife and I gathered a small group of people and we went off and planted a church. And that was just sort of the way church planting happened in those days. What's it been? It's almost 20 years ago now, I began working with Gateway and what's now Gateway Leadership Initiative, helping other people plant churches. And so got involved sort of in that side of it. Transitioned to an organization called Stadia, worked with them for almost a decade, helping plant churches, primarily here in the U.S. And then sort of unexpectedly had an opportunity to reimagine the last season of my ministry about 18 months ago. And so began thinking through, what's next? And both sort of strategically and I don't know that I'd say audible voice, but sort of conviction from the Holy Spirit was make more church planters. Because what I'd seen happen over that long journey of being engaged in church planting was that the quality and quantity of those sort of raising their hands and saying, "I want to plant a church," had decreased drastically. And so if we don't make more church planters, we won't have any new churches. That reality is probably far closer than most people can actually imagine. And so that's really the vision of what the new organization we've created called Multiply Project, book that I just wrote. And really just sort of for me, sort of the personal mission for this last season of my life is just sort of answering that question and figuring out how do we make more church planters.
It's exciting to learn from someone who's been a part of so many different church plants. Multiplyproject.org is where you can find out more about Craig. And we're going to be giving away free copies of your book to those who are already signed up for my email newsletter. You can do that at ericbryant.org. Before we jump into the project, Multiply Project, I want to hear more about some of the things you're seeing amongst effective church planners kind of post-pandemic. I mean, you've seen all sorts of different strategies and mission fields that people are targeting, yes. But I'd love to hear in the more recent years, what are some of the things you're seeing God doing through church planners?
Yes. And I think there's definitely some, cultural macro shifts that impact all of this. Certainly, like one of the big shifts I would say is from kind of in my generation, what was the parachute drop church planter? That was the most common thing. You find a church planter, you just send them to someplace, really in many ways like a missionary you'd send, around the world. We're seeing that less and less and seeing it be less and less effective, that local church planters are far more effective than imported church planters. Need a longer perspective, probably 75 years to recognize that, in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, American culture was American culture, right? It was largely, there were nuances, but there was just so much that was in common. Well, that's not true anymore. We don't watch the same TV shows, listen to the same radio stations, consume the same content, news. All of those things has just become so fragmented that cultures are very much these little subcultures that are pockets in places. And so there's a need to really understand the context you're in. It helps if you're from it. It's also the shift from, an era when you could, start a church by finding a place to meet, hanging a banner, telling people you had, great messages, good coffee, fun kids programs, contemporary music, and people would show up. You're in Austin, I'm in Sacramento. Both of us know that we could do that, and the only people who might show up are disgruntled Christians, and you don't want them in your new church anyway.
Right.
Right. So
Exactly.
you have to reach people in some other way. And so the other thing is that church planners who are effective typically already have influence. They have a circle, they have relationships. We like to say, they already have a tribe that they've been investing in and introducing to Jesus. And so the new church is sort of an outgrowth of that, rather than the fact that they just kind of landed someplace and started a church service. That may still work in some places, but in my context, it doesn't work at all. The other big shift, I think, is financial, is funding. And so, we just had a model for decades that was built on, you get a little bit of upfront funding, but basically you sort of count on the fact that we're going to start a church that's going to grow fast enough to pay my salary within 12, 18, 24 months. Boy, that just doesn't happen very often anymore. Particularly when you have some urban context cities. I know it here, Austin, we go, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. Chicago is probably the one exception. I mean, Denver would fit this, Seattle fits this. It's just so expensive to be there. And that's part of why sometimes local people have an advantage, is they've sort of already figured out the financial sustainability piece. They've got roots, they've got some finances somehow. And so they're a lot less likely to get 18, 24 months in and disappear because they've run out of money.
Right.
And so that's another big dynamic, I think, that shifted. And a lot of that, I know, you try to focus a bit on, how do we make disciples in a post-Christian context? And sort of underlying all of that is really that reality that just the culture we operate now is not one that's biased towards faith, not biased towards following Jesus. It's biased away from. And so whether it's my neighbors, my community, our larger American context, we're missionaries.
Yeah.
In some ways, more missionaries than places we used to send missionaries to 50 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. Well, and if there's someone out there, they're listening and they have a heart for reaching people, but they've never saw themselves as a church planter, like what are some of the things you've been sharing with people to kind of prepare them to even consider moving into this realm of ministry?
So there's a couple of big things. We've got a list actually of 9 characteristics that we look for in potential church planners. And at the top of the list, and really the one that is the most significant, is someone that has what we just call, again, a tribe, a group of people, or sometimes it's a place that they already have some passion for, feels some sense of calling to introduce those people to Jesus. It could be as simple as a neighborhood. It could be a workplace. Sometimes it's a particular kind of person. I have a friend here in California who has created a whole ministry and started a church for an unhoused population, because that's really where his passion was. So that, who those people are, that's up to you. But it's really sort of, you start with a people, you don't start with a church. And so someone who sort of has that sense of burden for the lostness of some people around them, that's a huge clue that you might actually be a church planter. Obviously, we're looking for people that are capable of envisioning something that doesn't yet exist. And so there's sort of this intuitive way that people think. I know you're that kind of person, that kind of leader. And so you see things and you come up with ideas that don't necessarily have to be incredibly innovative, but they don't exist. You're not looking at what is, you're looking at what could become. And you have the ability to think through that and make that thing become real. Not everyone has that ability. And that's not trying to say that people who don't have a huge place in God's kingdom. But starting a church will be hard for you if you need to see, taste, touch, hear, everything in order to know how to move forward. The other thing that we've discovered is really significant is finding people that have overcome significant obstacles. When you have that experience in your life, and just as sort of something that you've overcome, then the difficulties of church planting, and it is difficult, but they seem small and they seem insignificant. And so you don't get derailed. But if planting a church is sort of the most difficult thing you've ever done, the first time you've sort of stepped into a space where you might fail, it's difficult. Oftentimes it's people who've had experiences that not only could they have failed at, maybe you almost would say they should have died. Like they shouldn't be here, right? That's the kind of risk they've been in, and they overcame that. And then you're like, all right, this just seems easy.
Yeah. Yeah, planting a church is no problem now.
No problem.
Yeah.
Or at least, and maybe it's still difficult, but the mindset about how you think and feel about things when they don't work out the way you wanted them to just sort of goes in a different bucket in your life, because you have an experience that says this difficulty compared to this difficulty is just, God's got this and I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. Well, and talk about, for those who are interested in church planting, what are some of the ways that the Multiply Project can train them up? What are some of the
Yeah.
resources you point
Yeah, so
towards?
we're actually focusing on working through the local church. So that's one of the big things that we believe very strongly, is that the church needs to become the training ground. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Bible colleges, seminaries, but for part of it is sort of a mindset of, I know you've been educated already, you're well educated. It's sort of the difference between teaching and training, right? There is information that's hugely valuable and definitely accelerates what you are able to do, but it's also possible to have the information and not have the skill. And so what we see, and particularly in church planting, is that the issue, especially today, is not a lack of information. The information is a lack of skill. And so the best way to acquire skill is with practice. And so we're working with churches around the country to help them develop training programs in the context of their local church, where a person can begin to practice the skills of church planting, then eventually and hopefully be sent by that person, by that church, to plant a church. And we're also discovering that that is hugely significant as well. Church planters who have parents do much better than those that don't, which was part of the flaw of the parachute drop model.
Yeah. We had a young man serving on our team here in South Austin and really felt a call to one day be a church planter. And so post pandemic, I just said, well, let's start a Sunday night service. It's the
Yep.
same sort of muscles.
Yeah.
Start from scratch. I mean, in similar ways, he already had a tribe to draw
Yep.
from. But I love that idea. In fact, your book, The Antioch Way, is about helping pastors raise up more church
Yes.
planners. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yes. So it's really, the title, it's based on Acts chapter 13, just the first three verses. I don't know, in my background, the Jerusalem church was always held up as our church should be like the first church in Jerusalem in Acts 2:42, fellowship, the breaking of bread, like all these things that were supposed to be part of church. And there's a lot of value there. I don't want to dismiss that as not important,
Sure.
but we forget that Jesus told them to be witnesses in Judea, Samaria, of the ends of the earth. And, here's this mega church in Jerusalem, and they haven't sent anybody.
Yeah. And the only people that end up leaving were when they were persecuted.
When they were persecuted, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you have Acts 11, where it actually tells us that some of those persecuted people who went to Antioch were the first ones to begin telling Greeks about Jesus. So also up to this point, they'd only been telling Jews like themselves about Jesus, right? So this
Yeah.
was the roots of the Antioch church. And then in verse 13, in the church at Antioch, it names these five people. While they were worshiping, fasting, and prayer, the Holy Spirit says, set apart Barnabas and Saul. So church planters came from within their congregation, and they sent them out. We know what happened on that first journey. They planted at least 4 churches that we can name based on what's recorded. And then they came back home and celebrated what God had done through them. And so out of that, we've sort of pulled this model of calling, equipping, sending, and celebrating. And that in order to become a reproducing church like the church in Antioch, those are the 4 core activities that you need to be doing in your church. And if you'll do that, then you can become a reproducing, multiplying church, just like the church in Antioch did.
That's really great. I love that. Obviously, that Antioch church was incredibly diverse. They worked through conflict. They had I love that kind of reframing the story around how important that church really was. I mean, the rest of the book of Acts are the people they sent out.
Yes. And if we just look at it sort of historically, you think about what happened in Jerusalem, even over just sort of the next 50 years, right? Eventually, Jerusalem's pretty much destroyed. So the church there would have been completely scattered at that point. And then think about just from the fact that, I'm a Gentile, I'm not a Jew. And so if if the gospel never moved into the Greek world, we might not be having this conversation, right?
Yeah.
So all of that sort of goes back to the importance and the significance of the Antioch church.
Well, and it's also, I think, really important, obviously, the way that Luke shares the story of the church. James, the brother, half brother of Jesus, is leading the Jerusalem church, but then who are Barnabas? Who's Saul? Paul was this guy who the Jerusalem church didn't really have or want. He was back in Tarsus. It just is a reminder that you don't have to be, the son of a famous preacher to plant a church. It could be any one of us that God
Yes.
might call to do just that.
Yes. And one of the things that we're working on as we work with churches is really trying to help people reimagine not only how our church planners equipped or trained, but who might actually be a church planner. Again, there's sort of this, I would really say almost like a Timothy mindset in a large part of the Church America, evangelical church in America. There's sort of this, young favored son, whether that's literal, son, or whether that's just, some young person in the church. Again, sort of the student pastor, the young minister. But sort of think of the contrast of who Barnabas was and who Timothy was. Barnabas, we don't know how old he was, but he wasn't young. We know about him we know his original name was Joseph. Barnabas is his nickname, right? Son of encouragement.
Yeah.
He sold a piece of land and gave it to the church very early in the life of the Jerusalem church. So he had to have been old enough at that point to have somehow acquired that and be in a position to give that away. So we think maybe he had some wealth. If nothing else, he was certainly very generous. He wasn't from Jerusalem. He was from Cyprus. So he might have been one of those men from Cyprus and Cyrene in Acts 11 that actually was a part of founding Antioch. We don't know that, but he could have been. Maybe it was just some people he knew that did that. I don't know. And so you sort of move from, hey, who's the young leader in our church, the Timothy, to who's the experienced leader in our church. I don't know if they say old, but they might be in their 40s, might be in their 50s, and they've been successful and they've got resources. But at this point in their life, they're more concerned about introducing people to Jesus than they are about making more money or building a bigger company or moving further up the ladder. That's a very different perspective of who we should be thinking of as a church planner than sort of where we've looked, right? Looking for Barnabas's instead of looking for Timothy's.
I was just in India with one of our global partners and heard the story of a couple from Gateway who basically he retired kind of young and then they became overseas foreign missionaries, and then even this last week, I told that story to a man in our church who his hope is to step into ministry after his 9-year-old now is off in college, so there is a level of openness that for some, the finances are no longer a problem. They're ready to give their life. And so I love that. What sort of encouragement do you have for pastors who are doing ministry? Maybe they're discouraged. Maybe the thought of like sending off church planner for my church. I'm desperate for everybody I can have now. Like, what are some words of advice for those that might be wondering those sorts of things?
Sure. I think one of the first things is a mindset shift. The last chapter of the book just lists a whole bunch of mindset shifts. So I think a lot of times we've thought of multiplication as an app that we add to our existing operating system, but it doesn't work that way. We just did a training this last weekend down in Houston with some people and sort of illustrate this. I had the pastors at the host church come up and I'm the strange person with an Android phone, right? So I hand him my Android phone and say, hey, can you change my ringtone? He couldn't even find the settings on my phone, right? Because it's a different operating system. And so we try to do that. So helping people think through those shifts. And one of those is this kind of shift from gathering to sending and just changing our mindset of what really success looks like. And I think, unfortunately, in the American context, we sort of only count the success that the church I pastor has as part of my success. But what if you become a sending church? I mean, the couple you just talked about in India, are they part of Gateway's success? I mean, I would say yes.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so when you shift that mindset, then you start to think a little bit less about how do I find that one more person, to sit there and listen to me teach, into how do I find those people that I could send out? And maybe a decade from now, the church I'm pastoring here isn't much bigger than it is right now. But the influence of my church and the impact of my church in Jesus' kingdom is tenfold of what it is right now.
Yeah.
And so there's just a mindset shift that's needed and sort of think differently. But that's not really how we've thought of what success is in the American church. And so there is sort of this idolatry of growth that we kind of have to get past in order to then say, you know what, I'm going to invest myself in multiplication rather than just exclusively invest myself in
Yeah.
growth.
You
We do
know,
find that
we
churches that multiply actually grow, by the way, which is
that's
sort of
right.
the counterintuitive thing. You begin to send people and you begin to have just a different mindset about mission that actually causes your church to grow. And so they're not mutually exclusive. It's a both and.
Yeah.
But if you're hyper focused on growth, it will be difficult to multiply.
Yeah.
If you focus on multiplication, you'll discover that brings about growth as well.
Great way to say that. Yeah, it was such a beautiful season between 2015 and 2021. We're a campus planting campus. We would send
Yes.
out a few families to plant in Pflugerville, and 70 people to plant in Buda, and 60 people to plant in Central Austin. There's something really beautiful about trusting God by sending out your very best and knowing He'll raise up others if you keep doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is making disciples who make
Yep.
disciples.
Yep. I remember this from Gateway's culture. I mean, it's been almost 20 years since I first began, working with Gateway and working at Gateway and church planting. And I remember just being there in those days and realizing so many people that I met that were part of the staff, part of the team, were not products of Bible college and seminary. They were people who
Right.
came to faith at Gateway.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
as they matured as disciples, felt this calling and had gifts and skills to use in ministry. And it was just sort of built into the culture of Gateway. And it was awesome.
Yeah.
And it did sort of create a different mindset too, because that was the case. And so you fast forward that, to what you were doing in multiplying campuses. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, this is just what we do.
This is who we're supposed to be.
Who we're supposed to be, right? It's not unusual or almost, it seems exceptional in sort of the bigger context, but in the context of Gateway, it's not exceptional at all. It's just normal. This is who we are, and this is what we do.
That's beautiful. Well, it's the Multiply Project, multiplyproject.org. The book is called The Antioch Way. Thank you, Craig, for investing in us and the future of the church through investing in church planners. So grateful for you.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us for the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Go to my website, ericbryant.org, for my newsletter and free resources.